Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Leszek Szczepanski, and I'm a senior gameplay programmer at Guerrilla Games. And today I come to you from beautiful Amsterdam to talk to you about the basics of narrative systems design. But let's start at why I'm actually here talking to all of you. I've been working in the industry for almost 11 years. And in this time, I worked on almost 30 game projects in different roles: programmer, designer, lead. However, for the last 6 or so years, I've been focused on narrative systems in games. I've been creating systems which allow writers and designers weave stories into their games. I started with creating a full mission system for a mobile fighting game called Blade Lords. Narrative systems are not exactly very common in such games. However, it allowed us to add quite a bit of amount of variety into our gameplay. After that, I worked on a first-person shooter, Killzone Shadowfall, for PlayStation 4. And there I expanded upon the existing mission system to allow for creation of story arcs spanning multiple missions and levels. And finally, I created the quest system in the open-world action role-playing game Horizon Zero Dawn. A quest system with non-linearity at its base, which resulted in almost 250 quests in the final product. Over the course of this project, I realized how useful a deeply integrated story system is. And in this talk, I would like to tell you what it is and why you should have one and how to approach creating it. So this talk is mostly focused on game designers, technical designers, and gameplay programmers. So what actually is a narrative system? A narrative system is a gameplay system that manages progression of the story in the game and ties the narrative into the game mechanics. But what does this mean exactly, and why is this relevant? First thing worth noticing is that structurally games and stories have the same elements. First of all, goals, obstacles, and conflict. These are often parts of the very definitions of games, but are also central to any story. Characters. Stories are always about characters, real or fictional, human or not. Games have characters at their very center as well, whether it's Aloy from Horizon, Top Hat from Monopoly, or the nameless commander from Command & Conquer. Setting. When writing, you always create a world for your characters. In games, we also have worlds, whether as real as possible, as in The Witcher or the other RPGs, metaphorical, as in chess, or completely abstract, as in Tetris. Competition. Games always feature a form of competition, player against player or system. In stories, there's always a protagonist competing against an antagonist. Rules. Games have rules. This is the first thing we discuss when we talk about any kind of game. Movies and TV shows also have rules. Drama has rules. Characters must be motivated. Clues must be planted. Conflict must be resolved. Decisions and choices. A game is a set of interesting choices, as Sid Meier said. And in stories, we also have characters making dramatic choices. And finally, action. Stories or games are both about motion, changing of states. And similar parallels go even further. Game and story progression in practice follow similar patterns. If you are familiar with the concept of flow, you should be familiar with a master diagram. It shows how challenge in the game should increase with player skill in order to keep them maximally engaged. If a challenge is too great, the player will be frustrated. If the challenge is too low, the player will be bored. In the middle, between the two, exists this sweet spot, a tunnel of sorts, that we call the flow. The optimal experience of the game. That's the moment where the player is in the zone, when gaming is perfect and the time out in the outside world just fades away. Over our years, we have also learned that it's better to have not a fully linear increase of challenge, but to wiggle it a little bit in order to engage the player even more. If you're familiar with typical story progression, you would be familiar with a dramatic structure or the tension diagram, which shows how tension in the story progresses over time. It starts with the exposition. Here the audience learns about the setting. Characters are developed and a conflict is introduced. It is followed by rising action. The action leads the audience to the climax. It is common for complications to arise or for the protagonist to encounter obstacles. Then we reach the climax. This is the turning point of a story. The climax is characterized by the highest amount of tension. It is followed by falling action, which is the opposite of rising action. There, the story is coming to an end, and any unknown details or plot twists are revealed and wrapped up. And finally, the resolution. Here, the author's tone about their subject matter is revealed, and sometimes a moral or a lesson is learned. Also, we have learned over time that it is more interesting to make the rising action not linear by adding moments of higher and lower tension and mini climaxes. And if we put these two together, we can notice some certain interesting correlations. Because the player's skill increases over time, there are clear correlations between both diagrams, between both progressions. You can understand the exposition as the tutorial of the game, the rising action as the main game loop where the player's skill increases. All the mini climaxes will be the mini bosses, and finally the climax will be the final boss fight. In a perfect situation, the rising and dropping of a game challenge will be in sync with the rising and dropping of a narrative tension. As a game system, a narrative system sits usually in the middle of a game. It reads the state of a world and reacts to changes within the story. For example, the story might be impacted by the player befriending some characters. On the other hand, it might impact which opponents or NPCs spawn in the world. It listens to player actions and impacts player state. Every action the player performs, solving puzzles, defeating enemies, can be a trigger for progressing the story. However, a story might impact the player by, for example, changing the stats. It potentially influences also all game mechanics. For example, the game economy might be impacted by story changes. And finally, the story changes to the story are often displayed in the user interface. Let's talk about the basics for a moment. Let's see how we structure the narrative in games. All game narrative structures can be placed on a spectrum where on one extreme, the author has maximum control, and on the opposite extreme, it is the player who is in control of the story. It's a dialectic between a pre-crafted narrative and player self-expression. There are 5 most recognizable narrative types. From most author-centric to player-centric, they would be linear, branching, parallel, open, and procedural. However, in this talk, we will focus on the first 4. Procedural narratives are a different kind of beast and require very different approaches. So, what is a linear narrative? It is a narrative in which every player experiences events in the same order every time the game is played. But please keep in mind that linear doesn't have to mean simple. In a linear narrative, it is very common. Linear narratives are very common in games. Most games use this kind of structures. They are also very tightly controlled by the author because it allows for most expression for writers. The creation process is mostly similar to other media. A linear game script is not fundamentally different from a movie script. And player has no real control over the outcome of the game. In the end, the player witnesses the events as they are written with no relevant impact on how the story progresses. So if we were to put this on a diagram, it would be very simple. The scenes would flow linearly from one to the other, with one being active at a time. Games which use these kind of narratives are usually old-school adventure games, so point-and-clicks like Broken Sword or Secret of Monkey Island. But also certain action games like first-person shooters, Killzone, Fear, or action games like Vanquish. What is a branching narrative? It is a narrative in which the player makes choices that affect individual sections of the plot. Essentially, the plot has multiple branching paths from which the player can choose. Branching narratives are all about giving the player choices. Save a dragon, slay a princess. It is a combination of structured, writer-controlled story with player control over the direction and progression of the plot. Potentially, it can become very expensive with multiple big branches, for unique content has to be created for each branch. To combat that, often all of the branches come back together to a single point at some point in the story. And when creating such a narrative, you must accept that some players will never see certain pieces of content. So, in this example diagram, you can see the story splitting up. The player can first choose either scene B1 or B2. Later on, it branches again. The player can choose either scene C1 or C2, unless they already chose B2. After which, everything concludes in the final scene E. Games which use these kind of structures are usually modern adventure games. So we're talking about things like Dreamful Chapters or pretty much anything Quantic Dreams makes. But also some RPGs, and this is also very common in visual novels. A parallel narrative. It is an evolution of a branching narrative. Here, the player might be on multiple parallel branches at the same time. Player is free to approach the story in many different ways. However, some structure is still enforced upon them. Because the branches do not exclude each other, it can offer a lot of content for the player that is purely optional. Because the number of unique playthroughs through the story is equal to the number of combinations of all branches, it allows for a lot of player freedom while being still able to reuse content, making it much more cost-effective than a typical branching narrative. However, it requires a bit of a different kind of thinking on the part of a writer, as the flow of a story is very differently defined than they should be used to. And finally, it often defines a minimal story the player needs to experience that we usually call the critical path. Now, in this example, the player is given the choice to either immediately pursue the main part or is able to complete scene F and G in the optional branch. What is important here is that the player is able, at any point in time, switch between the branches. They do not exclude each other. Later, after completing scene B, the player is able to either pursue branch C, branch C, or branch D, or both, when finally finishing the story in scene E. Games which usually use these kind of structures are modern open-world RPGs, so things like The Witcher 3 or Horizon Zero Dawn. And finally, the open narrative. It is a narrative in which traditional story flow is non-existent. The player is free to approach the story in any way they wish. Because of that, it requires a very non-traditional approach to writing. Writers and designers need to give up control on the story flow. And story is usually built from small blocks with which the player can freely interact, whether these are quests or small activities. And as the number of combinations rises exponentially with every new story block, it's pretty much impossible to manually test all possible paths through the game. Now, here, as you can see, there are no arrows. The design does not suggest any paths between the scenes. The player is absolutely free to find their own. So they can start at scene A, progress through scenes B and D to end up at F. Or they can just start at C, progress through A and E, and finish at D. Actually, any other combination is also possible. And these kind of structures are usually used in big open games. So we're talking about open world role-playing games as well, like Fallout 3, or MMOs like World of Warcraft. Now, another structure we should quickly talk about is the internal structure of a game narrative. And going from top to bottom, we have the actual game narrative, which is the whole story as experienced by the player. And this narrative is usually composed of multiple story arcs, where a story arc is a set of connected stories revolving around a single entity, such as a character, place, or a faction. A story is a set of connected events and has a clear distinction between beginning, middle, and an end. And in this case, an event is understood as a scene, and that would be the most basic component of a story. It can be a battle, a conversation, or a puzzle. And a scene is usually composed of multiple verbs or actions that can be performed by the player, NPCs, or even the world. Now, in role-playing games, the narrative is usually structured around quests, so we use usually a bit different naming. So a story arc becomes a quest chain, a story becomes a quest, and a scene becomes a quest step. Sometimes some additional structures are added. Sometimes we add some superstructures that are usually named acts. And that means that arcs and stories can be grouped into these acts, which is useful for big games, where a clear separation between individual acts can be made. Also, we sometimes add certain substructures. And these can be useful if you want to give the player detailed instructions on what to do. Essentially, you can subdivide a story or a scene into sub-stories or sub-scenes to guide the player one by one on what to do. Now that we know more about story structures, let's discuss how do we actually design a narrative system. You will need to start by choosing your preferred story structure, as different games benefit from different ones. Think about what kind of game you're making, how much freedom you want to give to the player. Linear narratives are great for games with either very rich stories or very rudimentary ones. They are great if you want to tell a specific authored story. Have in mind a narrative from start to finish for the player to experience exactly as written. You want to have full control over pacing. If the exact pacing is important in your game, by not allowing the player to deviate from the written story, this structure will allow you for most control. If you want to push the player from set piece to set piece, if your game is composed of perfectly executed set pieces, this structure will allow you to frame them in the most convenient way. All kinds of action games and adventure games will benefit from this approach. Branching narratives are great for games where you want to emphasize the feeling of choice. They are great if you want to tell an authored story, meaning if you have a story in mind that you want to tell while allowing the player to impact its specific parts. If you want to provide a feeling of choice, by allowing the player to choose direction the story goes, you can explicitly make them feel that their decision have an impact. And if you don't want to rely on systems too much, the narrative will still be scripted and a writer authored, not a result of player interaction with systems. Adventure games and story-heavy RPGs where the difference between the player and the player character is a little blurred will greatly benefit from this approach. Parallel narratives are great for games where you want to make the player feel like an explorer. They're great if you want to provide a structure for a player-controlled story. You don't need to have full control over a story, but still want to provide some structure in which the player can move around. If you want to provide a feeling of choice and exploration, if you want to make the player feel that every decision has a potential impact on the narrative and they are not bound by linear progression, if you want to allow the player to approach problems in multiple ways, if you want to give the player as many options, allowing them to get as creative as possible while progressing through the game. Games which mix story with systems, like open-world RPGs and immersive sims, will find this approach useful. Open narratives are great for system-heavy games, where you just want to throw the player into the world. They are great if you want to base your game on systems. Even though you want to author the story, the true narrative of the game is to come together through player interaction with the systems. If you want to provide a feeling of openness and freedom, if you want to give the player as much as freedoms and options as possible, every direction, every option should be viable. If you want to create a world more than a specific narrative, you want to create a living, breathing world in which stories exist and happen, instead of authoring a story for which the world is merely a backdrop. Systemic, open games allow all kinds of open-world simulations, online or not, as well as strategy games can make good use of this approach. Second thing to determine is story units. Essentially, how do you want to divide your story? Which element from the story hierarchy will be present in your system? Is it an open game, or does it have levels? Do stories span whole worlds or multiple levels, or are they localized? Do you want to have clearly defined missions, or is the player free to explore and pick up tasks along the way? Do you want to present the player with very clear instructions on what to do with subscenes? Or maybe, do you want your narrative to be closely connected to characters? There is no silver bullet here. It more comes down to how you want to approach your narrative. If you want a lot of small stories, you can have less types of units. If you want less stories but complex ones, organizing your narrative into a more robust hierarchy might be a better idea. Progression of a story is always based on some sort of conditions. Therefore, you need to have an efficient condition system. What this means is that the narrative will progress based upon player actions or state changes of the world. The game designers must be able to put that into logical conditions which make sense in the context of other game systems. They need to be able to manage these conditions without going absolutely crazy, and the game needs to be able to handle hundreds of or even thousands of them without impacting the frame rate. Essentially, your condition logic can have three forms. These are the most used, most popular types of conditions in these kind of systems. First of all, you have a script-based condition, which is a condition which is a simple script used internally by your game engine. Secondly, you can have action-based, which means a condition is a specific object that monitors the player or the world for specific actions with specific results. Meaning you can configure a kill condition that monitors if the player has killed exactly 3 bandits. Or they can be specialized conditions. So essentially a mix of the two. A condition would monitor the whole game, waiting for changes to the player, world, or internal variables, where the user can extensively configure what result is desired, making it a simple but very specialized script. It is good to know if your system will ever need to run for multiple players. If so, you will need to decide where to store the story progression. Do you have a server, or is it saved locally? How to sync 2 players at different moments in the plot? How to sync 2 players who chose different branches? How and whether to differentiate between players? Does it matter which player performs actions required for progression? Again, there is no silver bullet here. There are as many ways to approach it as there are games. Make one player always in control. Make all stories possible to finish in one session. Divide the story into chunks in which progression being out of sync doesn't matter, and many more. Whatever you choose, these issues will need to be addressed very early in the game development process. The narrative system should be a separate module in your game that interacts naturally with other systems. Based on the game engine used, you will need to decide how it interacts with UI and scripting. It is also important to think about integration between other game systems. Will every story impact players standing with other various factions? Will progression always give XP? Do you want to automate giving of awards at the end? And so on. Also think if you want to push information to the other systems, or you want to have other systems to pull the information. Make sure that the narrative system is as well integrated with the game and the engine as AI, damage, or any other gameplay system that you might have. Bugs happen. There is no way around that, and they will need to get fixed. Story progression also often gets broken in games. You will need debugging tools that will allow the designers to show the story state. You need to visualize somehow how far the story has progressed beyond what's visible to the player. You want to show how the state actually came to be. You want to track and show the path the player took to arrive at the given point of the story. You want to be able to jump to a specific part of the story. There should be no need to repeatedly play through certain parts of a game in order to work on something later on. And you want to be able to revert the story state. It's useful to be able to quickly clear the whole story progression and start over when debugging. These tools will have a tremendous impact on your iteration time. When creating the system, have them in mind from the very beginning. When implementing the system, when creating the tools, think about who will be the main user of the system. Are these game writers? Are these game designers? What is their experience? Have they worked on similar games before? Are they familiar with the story structures and flow that will be in your game? What is their level of technical knowledge? Have they used scripting languages before, or are they familiar with other game editors? What concepts are they familiar with? What kind of vocabulary are they used to? The system is to empower them, so it needs to use terms, metaphors, and structures that will be understandable to them. It's good to think about certain additional issues that might pop up during development. First of all, skipping parts of a story. In nonlinear games, it is often possible to jump over certain parts of the story. It is a feature that players always appreciate. If you are able to solve a mystery before it is presented to you, you always feel smart. It might be worth enabling that in your narrative system, and think about what method would fit your game. Do you want to restructure your story graph by using smart graph methods to rebuild the story flow each time the player does something out of order? Or do you want every scene to be a potential start of the story? Or maybe do you want to create explicit parts of the story that can be skipped? Having to explicitly mark that certain scenes can be jumped over. As you can imagine, this list is not exhaustive, and every method has its pros and cons. Restructuring the graph makes it life easier for the designers, but might be quite a technical challenge. Marking scenes is simpler, but means more work for quest designers and QA. Think about what kind of stories are to be in your game and what kind of opportunities the player might have to skip parts of them. Second thing to consider is whether to use graph or text-based tools. Although most game engines nowadays represent their data as graphs, and for good reason, maybe for your game, text representation will be more useful. Maybe your game will not feature extensive VO, but you will want more in-depth options to modify text on the screen. So the benefits of using text over graph include: film script-like text is more familiar to writers. It will be easier for writers without much game experience to jump right in. It makes it easier to do direct modifications to the text. Your system can conditionalize individual words in the display text. It might integrate better with text scripting solutions. Your Lua, JavaScript, or whatever can be put directly into the system data. Benefits of using graph over text are: it's much easier to visualize nonlinear narratives. Graphs are a great tool for visualizing complex interconnected structures. Users are used to graph tools nowadays. More and more tools and engines are based on graphs, whether it's component or entity systems, conversations, or even scripting. It will integrate better with visual scripting. If your engine uses visual scripting, which becomes more and more common, a graph representation of a story system seems like a much better fit. It's better if a lot of other systems are impacted. If the narrative system impacts or it's influenced by a lot of different other systems, a visual graph representation allows for better visualization of such relations. And finally, patching. As mentioned before, there will be bugs. Unfortunately, there will also be bugs that you will ship with. Think about how the patching mechanism in your engine can be used for your narrative system. It should be possible to fix broken progression. It should be possible to reset the progression altogether. It might be needed to add and remove stories, and also might need to add and remove individual scenes. It might also need to allow for a full story restructure. Make sure that your save file structure and mechanism can handle such modifications. So I've talked for now about narrative systems, their structures, and design considerations. But let's address why you would create such a system in the first place. First of all, narrative systems are the connection between the story and the mechanics. They make it easier to think about gameplay and narrative together, because they meet in a single dedicated system and use similar concepts and units. Story needs to be broken into gameplay chunks. Each scene, each event, while written, will have game mechanics in mind. Gameplay needs to have story progression in mind. Player interaction with the game will always be done in the context of a narrative. It also helps to address some of the issues certain teams might have with integration of writers into the rest of a dev team. And that is because using same vocabulary and units allows for easier understanding between professions, as well as the system operates on ideas that both writers and designers are familiar with. Having the story as a system also has benefits because a lot of what otherwise would need to be done manually can be automated. We can automatically parse conditions for progressions into visual information for the player. Setting up a kill condition might automatically show an objective in the player HUD without any additional work. Any changes to features that the story progression depend on can be caught immediately. If certain functionality is being removed from the game, it's possible to quickly determine which quests or stories depend on it. All game systems can operate together without any in-between layer like sets of global variables. So the story has constant direct access to the player, world, state, and vice versa. Implementing choice and consequence relations becomes easier, as other parts of the game can naturally change their behavior based upon story progression. Story progression bugs are common in games. The more complicated the story, the more possibilities for errors there are. By making the story a game system, all the tools that we have for debugging the game can be repurposed to debug progression. It becomes possible to automate analysis of progression issues. No need for QA to run through every possibility manually. Things like automatically running unit tests become possible. You can run tests for every build of the game to make sure that progression doesn't break during development. Supporting the game post-release from the narrative side will be similar to support of other systems. As mentioned before, you can prepare methods for creating patches, and similar methods can be used for creation of DLCs. Also, if you use telemetry in your game, hooking it up to yet another system should not be a big problem. Customized narrative tools are also more convenient to make and integrate. Apparently, the most popular tool for game writing still is Excel, which frankly is absolutely crazy, and we really can do better. We have created so many tools for developing various parts of the game. Why not something for stories? Making the story a more integral part of the game, in technical terms, allows us to use the tool frameworks we already have to create something much better integrated and much more handy than a spreadsheet, be it a graph of some sort of a text method. With that being the final point, let's sum up what we have discussed today. First of all, narrative systems tie the story and mechanics together. Both use similar structures and principles, and a unified system makes sure that both stay in sync during gameplay. Secondly, you can customize the type of system you design to the type of game you are making by choosing appropriate structure and story unit. Whether you're making a linear first-person shooter or an open-world RPG, there are patterns you can follow that will naturally fit the narrative you have in mind. Condition logic, as well as player, world, and NPC actions that can progress the story. These will make sure that your narrative is tied to the actual mechanics of the game. And finally, having the story as a game system simplifies integration with the rest of the game, making debugging and post-release support easier. With all of this said, I hope you found all of this interesting and you have now a better idea what a narrative system is, why it might be useful in your game, and how to approach creating one. Thank you all for listening.
Ida, thank you for telling us all of that stuff. And maybe you guys have any questions? I'm sure you do have questions, so raise your hand. You do. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really nice. About story graphs, eventually when you came up to developing it, you definitely should use some kind of version control system, since probably there's more than one person working on it. And while iterating over it, do you prefer to consider it as a binary data? So when someone is working on it, it does exclusive lock and then made modifications and then just submit these code changes? Or you are kind of comfortable with merging stuff? For example, if someone makes one branch and then another and then merge, so you could make work parallel.
So this is like a much deeper philosophical discussion on how you want to structure your game data in general. But I think having more of a text-based approach in which you can actually merge any kind of data is much more useful because you can kind of manually avoid any clashes. You can say this quest designer works on this quest, this designer works on this quest. But if suddenly this designer works halfway, goes sick, and somebody else has to finish his work, it's easier to merge everything rather than to look in the editor what's going on. So if possible, I would go for the text-based approach simply because it's more convenient for like edge case situations.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Be brave. Raise hand. Yes.
Yeah, really great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I was just wondering about the sort of debug and automated testing tools that you mentioned. Like, so you had this sort of, this quest can be completed, that sort of things. I was just wondering how you dealt with when designers might delete parts of that quest or, change what quest's dependencies. How did you make sure that when they wanted to make a small change, it didn't they couldn't commit it because it failed this automated test? Like, what was your strategy for?
So essentially, the idea is that when you submit something to main, you don't submit halfway through. So you try to submit complete content, and if you're submitting something really big, you try to divide in logical kind of parts, right? So if you are modifying a quest, say the start of a quest, you want to make it progressible at least to a certain point, and if you would be making a sort of a unit test based on that quest, then you would want to make sure that the unit test knows about how far it needs to progress for the test to fail or succeed, right? So it's more about, some teams like to submit things as soon as possible. I think it's better to submit things in like logical units, which should make sense in the game terms.
Okay, that's my question. Thank you.
The lunch is only in several minutes. Oh yeah, one more.
Hello. Regarding the overarching kind of methods, you said, of having very linear story versus kind of more open, and they progressively kind of get either one side or the other. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen a game execute like in a hybrid way where, let's say, it's partly open or partly linear, or some kind of innovative way of combining not just a direct neighbor on that graph?
Well, actually, the truth is that no one really uses explicitly just one method. It's always like a mix and match to an extent. And a good example is, I don't know, actually Fallout or Witcher or even Horizon Zero Dawn. So the idea is that you have these quests spread around the world and you can approach them in any order you want. However, if you play through a specific quest, it can be very linear, right? So you sort of get into like these modes that you play through a specific quest and it's very linear. Or you might play through a different quest and it's super branchy and gives you a lot of options. So in that regard, it's I think quite common to do some mix and match. I think only like very systemic MMOs do this, like they spread things all around the world and just go figure out stuff.
Thank you. All right. Then, Leszek, thank you so much. It was really interesting to listen.
Okay, thank you very much.